The city lights sparkled like diamonds below as Victoria looked out from her corner office on the 47th floor. At 32 years old, she had everything most people could only dream of. Her tech company was worth billions of dollars. She owned 3 houses, drove the latest sports car, and wore clothes that cost more than most people made in a month, but success had changed her. The girl who once smiled at everyone and helped her neighbors had become cold and distant. She rarely looked people in the eye anymore, especially those she considered beneath her social status. It was almost 9 in the evening when Victoria finally decided to leave her office. The building was mostly empty except for the security guards and the cleaning crew. As she gathered her expensive leather briefcase and checked her diamond watch, she heard the soft sound of wheels rolling across the marble floor outside her office. Through the glass walls, she could see the night janitor working quietly. He was a man in his early 30s, wearing the standard blue uniform of the cleaning company. His name tag said David, though Victoria had never bothered to read it before. He moved slowly and carefully, making sure not to disturb anything on the desks as he emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces. David wore small headphones while he worked, nodding slightly to whatever music he was listening to. His movements were precise and respectful. He never touched personal items on the desks, never looked at confidential papers, and always left everything exactly as he found it. Victoria watched him for a moment, feeling annoyed. In her mind, he was just part of the building's background, like the elevators or the air conditioning. She had no idea what his story was, where he came from, or what dreams he might have. To her, he was simply the janitor, nothing more, nothing less. As she walked past him toward the elevator, David noticed her and stepped aside respectfully, giving her plenty of room to pass. He pulled out one earbud and nodded politely. "Good evening, ma'am. Working late again?" Victoria barely glanced at him. "Yes, well, some of us have important work to do," she replied in a tone that suggested his work wasn't important at all. She pressed the elevator button harder than necessary, as if she was angry that she had to wait for it. David said nothing in response. He simply put his earbud back in and continued with his work. He had learned long ago not to take such comments personally. He knew that most people in expensive suits looked right through him, as if he was invisible. What Victoria didn't know was that David had a story worth telling. She didn't know that he had once performed on stages that she had only seen in magazines. She didn't know about the sacrifices he was making or the dreams he still carried in his heart. She didn't know that the hands pushing that cleaning cart had once moved across piano keys with the grace of a master artist. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and Victoria stepped inside without looking back. As the doors closed, she was already thinking about her dinner reservation at the city's most expensive restaurant. She had completely forgotten about David before the elevator reached the ground floor. Meanwhile, David continued his work in the quiet office. The building felt peaceful at night, away from the noise and stress of the business day. He enjoyed these quiet hours when he could work at his own pace and listen to his music. Tonight, like most nights, he was listening to classical piano pieces, the same music that had once been the center of his world. As he cleaned Victoria's office area, David was careful not to touch anything on her massive desk. He could see contracts worth millions of dollars, but he wasn't interested in the business deals. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about the small apartment where his elderly mother was probably asleep, hopefully feeling better than she had that morning. The medicine she needed was expensive, and the special care she required took most of his earnings from his day job and this night cleaning position. But David never complained. His mother had sacrificed everything to support his music education when he was young. Now it was his turn to take care of her. He finished cleaning Victoria's office and moved on to the next area. The building had many floors, and his shift would continue until dawn. But David didn't mind the long hours. This job, combined with his day work, was helping him save money for something important, something that might change both his and his mother's life. As he worked, David thought about the piano in the executive lounge on the top floor. He had seen it many times while cleaning, a beautiful grand piano that seemed to be there just for decoration. He wondered if anyone in the company actually played it, or if it was just another expensive item meant to impress visitors. Sometimes when he was sure no one was around, David would stop and look at the piano keys. His fingers would move slightly as if remembering songs from long ago, but he never dared to actually play it. That would be crossing a line, and he needed this job too much to risk it. Victoria, meanwhile, was sitting in her fancy restaurant, eating dinner that cost more than David made in a week. She was discussing business deals with other wealthy people, completely unaware that just a few floors above her office, a man with an extraordinary gift was quietly emptying her trash bin. The next morning would bring new challenges for both of them. Victoria would continue building her empire, focused on profits and power. David would continue his quiet work, carrying his secret talents and his hidden past like invisible treasures that no one bothered to discover. Neither of them knew that their worlds were about to collide in a way that would change everything. Neither could imagine that a simple mistake and a moment of cruel mockery would lead to one of the most surprising revelations either of them had ever experienced. For now, they existed in the same building but in completely different worlds. One world of privilege and power, another of quiet dignity and hidden dreams. The boardroom on the 45th floor was filled with tension. 12 of the most powerful people in the business world sat around a polished table that cost more than most people's cars. Victoria stood at the front of the room, her presentation slides glowing on the massive screen behind her. Today was crucial. She was announcing the company's best quarterly results in 5 years. As you can see, Victoria said, pointing to a chart showing rising profits, our revenue has increased by 47% this quarter alone. The board members nodded approvingly. These numbers meant bonuses, stock prices going up, and happy investors. Victoria felt confident and powerful as she clicked to the next slide. This was her moment to shine, to prove once again why she deserved to be the youngest CEO of a major tech company. She had worked for months preparing this presentation, and everything was going perfectly. Our new software platform has exceeded all expectations, she continued, her voice strong and clear. We've signed contracts with 3 major corporations just this month, and we're projecting even higher growth next quarter. The board members were impressed. Some were already calculating how much money they would make from their stock options. Victoria smiled as she saw their pleased expressions. This presentation would definitely secure her position, and probably lead to an even bigger budget for next year, but then something unexpected happened. David was working quietly in the corner of the boardroom, dusting the tall windows that overlooked the city. He had been trying to be invisible, as he always did during important meetings. The executives usually ignored him completely, which was exactly how he preferred it. He was reaching up to clean a high spot on the window when his elbow accidentally bumped into a small decorative plant sitting on the windowsill. The plant, in its heavy ceramic pot, wobbled for a moment before crashing to the marble floor with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the silent boardroom like a gunshot. Dark soil scattered across the white marble floor, and pieces of the broken pot flew in several directions. A few chunks of dirt even landed near the expensive leather shoes of the board members. Every person in the room turned to stare at David. The confident atmosphere that Victoria had been building suddenly disappeared. Her perfect presentation had been interrupted by what she saw as carelessness from someone who shouldn't have been there in the first place. Victoria's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. She had been in the middle of making the most important point of her presentation, and now everyone was looking at the mess on the floor instead of listening to her success story. Are you serious right now? Victoria snapped, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. Some of us are trying to run a billion-dollar company here. David immediately dropped to his knees and began gathering the broken pieces of the pot with his hands. I'm so sorry, he said quietly, not looking up at anyone. I'll clean this up right away. I'm really sorry. But Victoria wasn't finished. The interruption had embarrassed her in front of the most important people in her business world, and she wanted to make sure everyone knew that this wasn't her fault. "This is exactly why cleaning should be done after business hours," she said, loudly, making sure every board member could hear her. "We're discussing millions of dollars in contracts, and we have to stop because someone can't dust a shelf without breaking things." The room was painfully quiet except for the sound of David, carefully picking up pieces of pottery and soil. His hands were shaking slightly, whether from nervousness or something else. Victoria couldn't tell and didn't care. One of the board members, an older gentleman named Robert, looked uncomfortable. "Victoria, perhaps we should just continue with the presentation," he suggested gently. "These things happen." But Victoria was too angry and embarrassed to let it go. She needed to reestablish her authority and show that she was in control of every situation, even unexpected ones. "No, this is important," she said, crossing her arms. "We have standards in this company. We have protocols. This kind of carelessness is exactly the opposite of the precision and excellence we expect from everyone who works here." David continued cleaning without defending himself. He swept the soil into a small pile with his hands and carefully placed the broken pottery pieces in his cleaning cart. He worked quickly but thoroughly, making sure every speck of dirt was removed from the expensive marble. Victoria's assistant, Lisa, who had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, finally spoke up. "David actually has a college degree," she said softly, trying to help the situation. "He's quite educated and very reliable. This was just an accident." Victoria turned to Lisa with a look that could freeze water. "I don't care if he has 10 college degrees," she said coldly. "What I care about is that our quarterly presentation was interrupted because someone couldn't do a simple cleaning job without breaking things." The board members were becoming more uncomfortable by the minute. They had come to hear about profits and business strategy, not to watch their CEO humiliate a janitor who had obviously made an honest mistake. David finished cleaning and stood up slowly. His uniform was dusty and his face was red with embarrassment. "Again, I'm very sorry for the interruption," he said to the room in general, not making eye contact with anyone. "It won't happen again." As he pushed his cart toward the door, Victoria couldn't resist one final comment. "Make sure it doesn't," she said sharply. "Some of us have real work to do." The door closed behind David with a soft click, leaving an awkward silence in the boardroom. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Robert cleared his throat and said, "Well, shall we continue with those impressive numbers you were showing us?" Victoria tried to regain her composure and return to her presentation, but the energy in the room had changed. The board members were still polite and professional, but the excitement and enthusiasm from earlier had been dampened by the uncomfortable scene they had just witnessed. As Victoria continued talking about profit margins and growth projections, she didn't notice that some of the board members were no longer paying full attention to her slides. Instead, they were thinking about what they had just seen, a powerful CEO humiliating a worker for an honest mistake, and they weren't sure they liked what that said about her character. Meanwhile, David was in the supply closet on the same floor, trying to calm his shaking hands. The embarrassment burned in his chest, but it wasn't the first time he had been treated poorly, and he knew it probably wouldn't be the last. He took a deep breath, straightened his uniform, and prepared to continue his work. He had no idea that this humiliating moment was just the beginning of a series of events that would soon change both his life and Victoria's in ways neither of them could possibly imagine. 3 days had passed since the incident in the boardroom, but Victoria was still irritated every time she thought about it. The board meeting had ended well enough. The members approved her budget and praised the quarterly results, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the interruption had made her look less professional than she wanted to appear that evening. Victoria was working late again, trying to finish a proposal for a new client. The office was quiet except for the distant sound of the cleaning crew working on other floors. She decided to take a break and walk to the executive lounge on the top floor, a luxurious room reserved for important clients and high-level meetings. The lounge was like something from a fancy hotel. It had comfortable leather sofas, expensive artwork on the walls, and a full bar stocked with the finest wines and whiskeys. But the centerpiece of the room was a magnificent black grand piano that sat near the large windows overlooking the city. Victoria had always loved having the piano there. It impressed visitors and made the company seem cultured and sophisticated. The piano had cost more than most people's entire salaries, but Victoria thought it was worth every penny for the image it created. Of course, she couldn't actually play it herself, but that wasn't the point. As she entered the lounge, Victoria was surprised to see David there, carefully wiping down the piano's glossy surface with a soft cloth. He was being extremely gentle, treating the expensive instrument with obvious respect. His cleaning supplies were neatly arranged on a nearby table, and he had covered the leather furniture with protective sheets to avoid getting any cleaning products on them. The sight of David immediately brought back Victoria's annoyance from the boardroom incident. She still felt embarrassed about that day, and seeing him reminded her of the moment when her perfect presentation had been interrupted. "Well, well," Victoria said as she walked into the room, her voice carrying a tone of sarcasm. "Being extra careful around expensive equipment tonight, I see." David looked up from his work and nodded politely. "Good evening, Miss Sterling. Yes, I always try to be very careful, especially with delicate items like this piano." Victoria walked closer, watching as David continued to gently polish the piano's surface. Despite her irritation with him, she had to admit that he was being very thorough and respectful with the cleaning. The piano gleamed under the soft lights of the lounge. "Don't tell me you actually know anything about pianos," Victoria said, crossing her arms and leaning against the bar. "I suppose you're going to tell me you're some kind of musician, too." David paused in his cleaning and looked at her. There was something in his expression that Victoria couldn't quite read, not anger or defensiveness, but something deeper, almost sad. "I do know a little about music," David said quietly, returning to his work. "I've always loved piano music." Victoria laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. "Right, I suppose next you'll tell me you went to some fancy music school. What's next? Are you going to claim you've performed at Carnegie Hall?" David didn't answer immediately. He continued cleaning the piano bench with careful, gentle strokes. Victoria could see that her comments were affecting him, but instead of feeling bad about it, she felt a strange satisfaction. After the embarrassment of the boardroom incident, she felt like she was regaining some control. "You know what?" Victoria said, walking even closer to the piano. "This whole situation is almost funny. Here you are, cleaning this incredibly expensive piano that probably costs more than you make in 5 years, and you're trying to tell me you know about music." David finished with the bench and started packing up his cleaning supplies. "I should probably move on to the next room," he said softly, but Victoria wasn't ready to let him leave. The stress of the past few days, combined with her natural tendency to assert her superiority, was making her unusually cruel. "Wait," she said, stepping between David and the door. "I'm curious now. You say you love piano music? You're being so careful with this piano, like you actually understand what it is, so tell me, do you actually play?" David looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said simply, "I do play." Victoria's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She had expected him to back down or admit he was just pretending. The fact that he had answered so directly caught her off guard, but it also amused her. "Oh, this is rich," she said, shaking her head with disbelief. "The janitor thinks he's a pianist. I suppose you're going to tell me you can play classical music too?" "I can play some classical pieces," David replied, his voice steady but quiet. Victoria felt a surge of cruel inspiration. Here was her chance to put this man in his place once and for all, to show him exactly where he belonged in the social hierarchy that she ruled. "Prove it," she said with a challenging smile. "But not just any piece. Anyone can plink out Twinkle, Little Star. If you're really a pianist, play something difficult. Play Chopin." David's expression changed slightly when she mentioned Chopin. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe even pain, but Victoria was too focused on her game to notice. "In fact," Victoria continued, warming to her theme, "let's make this interesting. You claim you can play piano, and you claim you can play classical music? So here's my challenge. Play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the whole thing. Perfectly. She crossed her arms and smiled with satisfaction at what she thought was an impossible challenge. Victoria knew just enough about classical music to know that Chopin's ballades were incredibly difficult pieces that only master pianists could perform properly. "And if you can actually do it," she said with a laugh, "if you can actually play that piece the way it's supposed to be played, then I'll—" She paused dramatically, thinking of something ridiculous enough to emphasize how impossible the task was. "I'll marry you. That's how confident I am that you can't do it." Victoria expected David to laugh nervously and admit that he was just pretending, or maybe to walk away in embarrassment. She expected him to make some excuse about not wanting to disturb anyone, or not being comfortable playing someone else's piano. What she didn't expect was for David to look directly into her eyes with an expression she had never seen from him before. It wasn't anger or defiance, but something much more complex, a mixture of sadness, determination, and something else that might have been memories of a life she knew nothing about. "All right," David said quietly, setting down his cleaning cloth. "I'll play it for you." Victoria's confident smile faltered slightly. She had expected him to back down, not to accept the challenge. But she quickly recovered her composure. After all, how good could a janitor possibly be at piano? At worst, he might know a few basic songs, but certainly nothing as complex as a Chopin ballade. "Wonderful," she said, gesturing toward the piano. With exaggerated politeness, "Please, be my guest." "I can't wait to hear this." David walked slowly toward the piano bench, and Victoria positioned herself where she could watch his face when he inevitably failed. She was already imagining how satisfying it would be to see him admit defeat, to put him firmly back in his place as just another employee who should focus on his cleaning duties and stop pretending to be something he wasn't. As David sat down at the bench and adjusted its height, Victoria noticed that his movements seemed strangely natural and confident. But she dismissed this observation. Probably just trying to look like he knew what he was doing. She had no idea that she was about to witness something that would shatter every assumption she had made about the quiet man who cleaned her office every night. She had no idea that her cruel challenge was about to reveal a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about talent, worth, and the power of judging people by their circumstances rather than their character. The executive lounge fell completely silent as David approached the piano bench. Victoria stood near the bar, arms crossed, wearing the confident smile of someone who was about to prove a point. She had thrown down what she believed was an impossible challenge, and she was already savoring the moment when David would have to admit he couldn't do it. But as David sat down at the bench, something unexpected happened. Instead of the nervous fumbling Victoria had anticipated, his movements were smooth and natural, like someone who had done this thousands of times before. He adjusted the bench height with the practiced precision of a professional, testing the distance from the keys with subtle movements that Victoria almost missed. "Take your time," Victoria said with mock patience, checking her expensive watch. "I know this might be a bit more complicated than you expected." David didn't respond to her comment. Instead, he removed his work gloves slowly and placed them carefully on the side table next to the piano. Victoria noticed that his hands, now free from the bulky gloves, looked different than she had expected. They were clean and well kept, with long, elegant fingers that seemed almost graceful as he flexed them slightly. He placed his hands gently on the keys without pressing them down, just feeling the familiar texture of the ivory and ebony. Victoria saw him take a deep breath, and for a moment his expression changed completely. The tired, humble look of the night janitor seemed to fade away, replaced by something she couldn't quite identify, a kind of focused intensity that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," David said quietly, almost to himself. "Op. 23. Victoria was surprised that he even knew the proper name and number of the piece. Most people who weren't serious about classical music wouldn't know those details. But she quickly dismissed this as probably something he had looked up online to try to impress her. David positioned his fingers over the keys in what Victoria had to admit looked like a proper starting position. His posture was perfect, straight back, relaxed shoulders, arms positioned exactly as she had seen in pictures of real pianists. But she remained confident that this was all for show. Then he began to play the first notes of Chopin's Ballade. No, one filled the room, and Victoria felt her confident smile freeze on her face. The opening melody was soft and haunting, played with a delicate touch that she had never heard before, not even from the expensive sound system in her penthouse apartment. But it wasn't just that David was playing the right notes. Victoria had heard this piece performed by famous pianists on recordings, and she could tell immediately that this wasn't the fumbling attempt of an amateur. Each note was placed with perfect timing and expression, creating a melody that seemed to float through the air like something magical. As the piece continued, Victoria found herself taking a step closer to the piano without even realizing it. The music was growing more complex, with David's left hand adding rich, deep bass notes while his right hand continued the beautiful melody. His fingers moved across the keys with a fluidity that looked almost effortless, but Victoria could sense the incredible skill required to make something so difficult appear so natural. The expression on David's face had transformed completely. Gone was any trace of the humble, apologetic janitor who had been cleaning the piano just minutes before. Instead, Victoria saw a man who was completely absorbed in the music, his eyes closed, his body moving slightly with the rhythm and emotion of the piece. Victoria felt a strange sensation in her chest, something between confusion and awe. She had expected David to play a few clumsy notes before admitting defeat. She had never imagined anything like this. The music was not just technically correct. It was beautiful, emotional, and powerful in a way that made her feel things she hadn't experienced in years. As the ballade progressed, the music became more dramatic and complex. David's hands moved independently, creating intricate patterns of melody and harmony that wove together into something that sounded like pure emotion. Translated into sound, Victoria could hear layers of meaning in the music that she had never noticed when, listening to recordings. The piece moved through different sections, sometimes gentle and reflective, sometimes passionate and dramatic. David navigated each change with perfect understanding, his playing revealing not just technical skill but deep musical knowledge and sensitivity. This wasn't someone who had learned a piece from a tutorial video. This was someone who understood the music from the inside out. Victoria realized that her mouth was slightly open in amazement. She closed it quickly and tried to regain her composure. But she couldn't take her eyes off David's hands as they moved across the keys. The same hands that she had seen emptying trash cans and wiping down desks were creating some of the most beautiful music she had ever heard in person. Other people in the building were beginning to notice the music too. Victoria could see security guards in the hallway outside the lounge, stopping their rounds to listen. Even Lisa, her assistant, had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the beautiful sounds echoing through the empty floors. As the ballade reached its most technically challenging sections, David's playing became even more impressive. His fingers flew across the keys and passages that required incredible precision and speed, but never once did he seem to struggle or make a mistake. Every note was clear and perfectly placed, even in the most difficult passages that would challenge even professional pianists. Victoria found herself thinking about all the assumptions she had made about David. She had seen him as nothing more than a janitor, someone whose only purpose was to clean up after more important people. She had never considered that he might have dreams, talents, or a story worth knowing. She had never bothered to wonder what his life was like outside of the few hours when she saw him working in her building. But now, listening to this extraordinary performance, Victoria was forced to confront the possibility that she had been completely wrong about David. This level of musical skill didn't develop overnight. It required years of study, practice, and dedication. It required the kind of passion and commitment that Victoria thought she understood from building her business, but which she was now seeing expressed in a completely different way. The music continued to build toward its climactic sections, and Victoria realized that she was holding her breath. She had challenged David to prove himself, expecting him to fail and thereby confirm her assumptions about him. Instead, she was witnessing something that was forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about worth, talent, and the dangerous habit of judging people by their circumstances rather than their character. As the ballade moved toward its conclusion, Victoria knew that whatever happened next, her relationship with David and her understanding of herself would never be the same. As David continued playing, the music seemed to transform the entire atmosphere of the executive lounge. What had started as Victoria's cruel challenge was becoming something she had never expected, a window into a world of beauty and skill that she had never imagined could exist in someone. She had dismissed so completely the middle section of Chopin's ballade. No one is known among musicians for its incredible technical demands and emotional depth. Victoria, who had chosen this piece specifically because she thought it would be impossible for David to play, now watched in growing amazement as he navigated every challenge with apparent ease. His left hand created a foundation of rich, rolling bass notes that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat, while his right hand wove intricate melodies above. The two hands worked together in perfect coordination, creating harmonies that filled the room with layers of sound that Victoria felt as much as heard. What struck Victoria most was not just the technical perfection of David's playing, but the emotion he brought to every phrase. She could see that he wasn't just playing notes from memory. He was telling a story through the music. Each section of the ballade seemed to express different feelings, sometimes gentle and nostalgic, sometimes passionate and urgent, sometimes melancholy and reflective. David's entire body moved with the music in subtle ways that showed his deep connection to what he was playing. His shoulders rose and fell with the breathing phrases of the melody. His head tilted slightly during the most expressive passages. Even his posture seemed to change with the emotional content of the music, becoming more intense during dramatic sections and more relaxed during gentle interludes. Victoria found herself completely absorbed in watching and listening. She had attended expensive concerts in the city's most prestigious concert halls, but somehow this private performance in her company's executive lounge felt more intimate and powerful than anything she had experienced before. Maybe it was because she was seeing David's transformation firsthand, or maybe it was because she was finally realizing how wrong she had been about him. The sound of David's playing was beginning to attract more attention throughout the building. Security guards who were making their rounds had stopped in the hallway outside the lounge, listening with expressions of surprise and appreciation. Victoria could see maintenance workers from other floors gathering quietly in the corridor, drawn by the beautiful music echoing through the empty building. Even some of the late-working executives from lower floors had come up to investigate the source of the music. Lisa, Victoria's assistant, was standing in the doorway with tears in her eyes, clearly moved by what she was hearing. A few other employees had joined her, all of them listening in respectful silence to David's extraordinary performance. Victoria realized that she was witnessing something rare and special, not just a talented performance, but a moment when music was bringing together people from completely different levels of the company hierarchy. The janitor, the security guards, the executives, and everyone in between were all united in their appreciation for David's gift. As the ballade progressed toward its most challenging sections, David's playing became even more impressive. His fingers moved across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed almost superhuman, yet every note remained clear and musical. Victoria could see the concentration on his face, but also a kind of joy that she had never seen in him before. The music told a story that Victoria was beginning to understand had nothing to do with words. Through Chopin's complex harmonies and melodies, she could hear emotions that she recognized from her own life: ambition, disappointment, hope, struggle, and triumph. But hearing these feelings expressed through David's playing made them seem more real and meaningful than she had ever experienced them in her business world. During one particularly beautiful passage, Victoria found herself thinking about her own relationship with beauty and art. She had bought expensive paintings for her offices and penthouse, but she had chosen them based on their price and prestige rather than any genuine appreciation for their artistic value. She had attended charity galas for the symphony and opera, but mainly to network with other wealthy donors rather than to enjoy the performances. Now, listening to David play, Victoria realized that she had been surrounding herself with the appearance of culture without ever really understanding what culture meant. She had used art and music as status symbols, but she had never experienced their true power to move and transform people. The ballade was building toward its dramatic climax, and David's playing was becoming more intense and passionate. His whole body seemed engaged in creating the music, and Victoria could see that this wasn't just a performance for him. It was an expression of something deep within his soul. She began to wonder about David's story. How had he learned to play like this? Where had he studied? What had brought him to work as a janitor when he clearly had the skills of a professional musician? For the first time since she had known him, Victoria was curious about David as a person rather than just seeing him as part of the building staff. The audience in the hallway had grown larger, and Victoria could see that everyone was completely captivated by David's performance. Some people had pulled out their phones to record the music, but most were simply standing in respectful silence, allowing themselves to be carried away by the beautiful sounds. As the ballade approached its conclusion, Victoria felt a strange mixture of emotions. She was amazed by David's talent, embarrassed by her own behavior, and confused about how she had so completely misjudged someone who worked in her building every day. But more than anything, she felt a sense of anticipation, knowing that when the music ended, she would have to face the reality of what she had just witnessed and what it meant about her own character and assumptions. The final section of the ballade was approaching, and Victoria knew that her challenge to David was about to be answered in a way she had never expected. She had asked him to prove himself, thinking that his failure would confirm her superiority. Instead, his success was forcing her to confront some uncomfortable truths about herself and the way she treated other people. As David's fingers prepared for the final dramatic passages of the piece, Victoria realized that this performance was changing more than just her opinion of David. It was changing her understanding of what it meant to recognize and respect true talent and worth in others. The final notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the executive lounge with such power and beauty that Victoria felt them resonate in her chest. David's hands moved through the concluding passages with masterful control, building to a climactic moment that seemed to capture all the emotion and technical brilliance of the entire piece. When the last note faded into silence, the quiet that followed felt sacred, as if no one wanted to break the spell that the music had created. For several seconds, nobody moved. David sat at the piano with his hands still positioned over the keys. His eyes closed, breathing deeply as if he was returning from somewhere far away. Victoria stood frozen near the bar, her face showing a mixture of shock, awe, and something that might have been shame. Then, from the hallway came the sound of applause. It started with Lisa clapping slowly and respectfully, tears still visible on her cheeks. The security guards joined in, followed by the maintenance workers and the few executives who had gathered to listen. Soon the applause filled the buildings. Upper floors, genuine and heartfelt appreciation for something beautiful they had just witnessed. Victoria didn't clap. She couldn't. Her hands remained at her sides as she stared at David, trying to process what had just happened. The confident, mocking smile she had worn at the beginning of the evening was completely gone. Replaced by an expression of complete bewilderment, David slowly opened his eyes and looked down at the piano keys. He flexed his fingers slightly, as if he was returning to the present moment after being lost in the music. Then he stood up from the bench, carefully replaced the piano cover over the keys, and turned to face the small crowd that had gathered. "Thank you," he said quietly to the people applauding in the hallway. His voice carried the same humble tone he always used, but Victoria noticed something different in his posture, a quiet dignity that she had never seen before. As the applause died down, Victoria finally found her voice. "How?" she asked, the single word carrying all of her confusion and disbelief. "How is this possible?" David looked at her with an expression that was neither proud nor defensive, just tired and sad. "It's a long story," he said simply, but Lisa stepped forward from the doorway, unable to contain herself any longer. David graduated from the New England Conservatory, she said, her voice filled with emotion. He was a concert pianist. A real one. He performed with major orchestras. Victoria's face went pale. What? She whispered. Lisa continued, looking back and forth between Victoria and David. He played at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, some of the most prestigious venues in the country. I looked him up online after I first met him because I could tell there was something special about him. Victoria felt like the floor was shifting beneath her feet. But ... She couldn't finish the question. David sighed deeply and sat back down on the piano bench, not to play, but because he suddenly looked very tired. I was in a car accident 3 years ago, he said quietly. A drunk driver hit my car while I was driving home from a performance. I was in the hospital for 2 months. He held up his left hand, and for the first time, Victoria noticed faint scars along his wrist and the back of his hand. The doctor said I might never play again. The damage to my wrist and hand was severe. I spent a year in physical therapy just to be able to use my hand normally for everyday tasks. Victoria felt a sick feeling growing in her stomach as she began to understand. The medical bills were enormous, David continued. Even with insurance, the costs of surgery, therapy, and rehabilitation ate through all my savings. And while I was recovering, I couldn't perform, so I had no income from concerts or teaching. Lisa added softly, and his mother became seriously ill around the same time. She needed expensive treatments and special care. David nodded. I had to find work that I could do while still rebuilding the strength and flexibility in my hand. Cleaning jobs were something I could manage, and they provided health insurance for both me and my mother. I work 2 jobs now, cleaning here at night and doing maintenance at an apartment complex during the day. Victoria stared at him in horror. As the full picture became clear, so you're working as a janitor because ... Because I needed to survive and take care of my mother while slowly working to get my playing ability back, David finished. It's taken 3 years of practice and therapy, but my hand is finally strong enough again to play pieces like the one I just performed. The executive lounge was completely silent except for the sound of Victoria's rapid breathing. She was beginning to realize the full magnitude of her cruelty and ignorance. The piano in this lounge, David said, gesturing to the instrument behind him. I've been cleaning it for 6 months. Sometimes, when I was sure no one was around, I would test my fingers on the keys, just a few notes at a time to see how my recovery was progressing. Lisa wiped her eyes and said, He's been saving money to audition for orchestras again. He wants to return to performing, but he needs time to build up his repertoire and his confidence after everything that happened. Victoria felt like she might be sick. I had no idea, she whispered. I thought you were just ... Just a janitor, David said, without bitterness. I understand why you would think that. Most people see the uniform and make assumptions. I don't blame them for it. But Victoria was beginning to blame herself. She thought about all the times she had walked past David without acknowledgement, all the dismissive comments she had made, and especially the cruel challenge she had issued just an hour ago. She had mocked a man who had lost everything and was working 2 demanding jobs to rebuild his life and care for his sick mother. David, she said, her voice shaking slightly, I'm so sorry. I had no right to treat you the way I did. What I said tonight, what I said in the boardroom, all of it was completely inexcusable. David looked at her with eyes that held no anger, which somehow made Victoria feel even worse. You didn't know my story, he said. Most people don't. That's no excuse, Victoria replied, feeling tears forming in her own eyes. I should have treated you with respect regardless of what job you were doing. There's no excuse for the way I behaved. The small crowd in the hallway was beginning to disperse, but several people stopped to shake David's hand or tell him how much they had enjoyed his performance. Victoria watched these interactions and realized that David was well liked by the building staff, something she had never bothered to notice before. As the crowd thinned out, Victoria found herself alone with David and Lisa in the executive lounge. The piano sat between them like a symbol of everything Victoria had failed to understand about the people who worked in her building. What happens now? Victoria asked, though she wasn't sure if she was asking David or herself. David stood up and began gathering his cleaning supplies. "Now I finish my shift," he said simply. "And tomorrow I continue working toward getting my life back." Victoria watched him prepare to leave and realized that this moment was a turning point, not just in her relationship with David, but in her understanding of herself and what kind of person she wanted to be. Victoria couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her king-size bed in her penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling as David's music played over and over in her mind. But it wasn't just the beauty of his performance that kept her awake. It was the crushing weight of her own behavior and what it revealed about the person she had become. She kept thinking about the expression on David's face when she had made her cruel challenge. She had seen something in his eyes that she now recognized as pain, but at the time she had been too focused on her own sense of superiority to pay attention. How many other moments of pain had she caused or ignored in her rush to prove her own importance? At 3 a.m, Victoria got up and walked to her home office. She opened her laptop and began searching online for information about David. It didn't take long to find what Lisa had mentioned. There were articles about his performances, reviews praising his extraordinary sensitivity and technical brilliance, and photos of him in formal concert attire, looking confident and proud on stage. One article from 4 years ago described him as one of the most promising young pianists of his generation. Another review of a performance at Lincoln Center called his interpretation of Chopin breathtaking and deeply moving. Victoria stared at these images and articles, trying to reconcile them with the quiet, humble man she had seen cleaning her office every night. But the most difficult part was finding the news coverage of his accident. The articles described a promising career cut short, a young artist fighting for his life in the hospital, and the uncertain future facing someone whose livelihood depended on the precise use of his hands. Victoria read about the fundraising efforts his friends and fellow musicians had organized to help with his medical bills, and she felt sick thinking about how he had been struggling financially while she complained about minor inconveniences in her privileged life. As the sun began to rise over the city, Victoria realized that this wasn't just about David. It was about a pattern of behavior that had developed in her life without her even noticing it. When had she stopped seeing the people around her as individuals with their own stories, dreams, and struggles? When had she started believing that her success gave her the right to look down on others? She thought about her rise to CEO and how it had changed her. The higher she climbed in the business world, the more isolated she had become from the everyday experiences of regular people. She surrounded herself with other wealthy executives, lived in expensive neighborhoods, and worked in a building where she was insulated from the realities that most people faced. Victoria realized that she had built walls around herself, not just physical walls like her corner office and penthouse apartment, but emotional walls that prevented her from connecting with anyone she considered beneath her social status. She had become the kind of person she would have disliked when she was younger and still remembered what it felt like to struggle. The next few days at work were torture for Victoria. Every time she saw David in the building, she felt a wave of shame and regret. She wanted to apologize again, to somehow make up for her behavior, but she didn't know how. What could she possibly say or do that would undo the cruelty she had shown him? She found herself paying attention to other employees in ways she never had before. She noticed the security guard who always said good morning with genuine warmth, even though she had never responded. She saw the woman who delivered mail with efficiency and care, taking time to organize everything perfectly despite being ignored by most of the executives. She observed the maintenance staff working quietly and professionally, keeping the building beautiful while remaining essentially invisible to the people who worked there. Victoria began to realize that her building was full of people she had never really seen. She had been so focused on her own success and importance that she had failed to recognize the human beings who made her comfortable, productive work environment possible. Each of these people had their own stories, their own dreams and challenges, but she had never bothered to learn anything about them. The weight of this realization was overwhelming. Victoria had always prided herself on being a good judge of character in business. She could evaluate potential employees, partners, and competitors with remarkable accuracy. But somehow, when it came to people she considered below her level, she had turned off that same perceptive ability. She started having conversations with Lisa about David and was shocked to learn how much her assistant knew about the lives of various building employees. Lisa knew that the security guard was putting his daughter through college, that one of the cleaning staff was studying for her nursing degree, and that several employees were supporting elderly parents or family members with disabilities. "How do you know all this?" Victoria asked during one of these conversations. Lisa looked surprised by the question. "I talk to them," she said simply. "They're interesting people with interesting lives. Plus, they work hard to make our jobs easier. I think they deserve basic courtesy and respect." Victoria felt another stab of shame. Her own assistant had been modeling the kind of behavior Victoria should have been showing all along. Lisa treated everyone with the same professional courtesy and genuine interest, regardless of their job title or salary level. As the week progressed, Victoria found herself looking up more information about classical music and piano performance. She wanted to understand what she had witnessed in David's playing, to appreciate the full magnitude of his skill and artistry. She listened to recordings of Chopin's ballades and realized that David's performance had been at the level of world-class concert pianists. She also researched the physical demands of piano performance and the challenges that musicians face when recovering from hand injuries. She learned that many musicians never fully recover from the type of injury David had sustained, and that his return to performing at such a high level represented years of determined effort and rehabilitation. Victoria began to understand that David's decision to work as a janitor wasn't a failure or a limitation. It was a practical choice made by someone who was rebuilding his life after a devastating setback. He was doing whatever was necessary to survive and care for his mother while working toward his goal of returning to professional music. The more she learned, the more impressed Victoria became with David's character. He had faced challenges that would have broken many people, but he had responded with dignity, determination, and grace. He worked 2 demanding jobs without complaint, treated everyone with respect despite receiving little in return, and continued pursuing his musical dreams. Despite enormous obstacles. By the end of the week, Victoria knew that she had to do more than just apologize. She needed to find a way to make a real difference in David's life, not just to ease her own guilt, but because she was beginning to understand that helping others was an essential part of becoming the kind of person she wanted to be. But first, she needed to figure out how to approach David in a way that showed genuine respect for his dignity and independence. She had already made the mistake of treating him as less than equal. She couldn't afford to make the mistake of treating him as a charity case either. 2 weeks had passed since the night David played Chopin in the executive lounge, and Victoria had spent every day thinking about how to approach him. She had considered various grand gestures, offering him money, setting up a scholarship fund, even arranging for him to audition with orchestras she knew through her business connections. But each idea felt wrong, as if she would be trying to fix her guilt rather than truly helping David in a way that respected his dignity. Finally, Victoria decided that the most important thing was simply to have an honest conversation. She needed to understand what David actually wanted and needed, rather than assuming she knew what was best for him. It was a humbling realization for someone who was used to making decisions for others. Victoria discovered that David often spent his break time in a small quiet room on the building's 20th floor. It wasn't really a chapel, but it had been designed as a meditation space for employees who needed a few minutes of peace during stressful workdays. It had comfortable chairs, soft lighting, and large windows that looked out over the city. On a Thursday evening, Victoria found David there during his break, sitting by the window and eating a simple sandwich. He looked tired but peaceful, taking a few minutes to rest between the intensive physical work of his cleaning duties. Victoria knocked gently on the open door. "David, could I talk with you for a few minutes?" David looked up, surprised to see her there. "Of course, Miss Sterling. Is there something wrong with my work?" "No, nothing like that. Victoria said quickly. Actually, that's part of what I wanted to talk about. May I sit down? David nodded, and Victoria took the chair across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victoria realized that this was the first time she had ever had a real conversation with David, despite the fact that he had been working in her building for 6 months. I owe you a much better apology than the one I gave you that night, Victoria began. What I did was cruel and inexcusable. I treated you terribly, not just that evening, but every day since you started working here. I'm deeply sorry for that. David set down his sandwich and looked at her carefully. I appreciate that, he said, but you don't need to keep apologizing. You didn't know my background, and I understand why you would make assumptions based on my job. That's exactly the problem, Victoria said. I shouldn't have treated you poorly regardless of your background. Everyone deserves basic respect and courtesy, and I failed to give you that. It shows something about my character that I'm not proud of. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the city lights below. Victoria had rehearsed this conversation many times, but now that she was here, she realized that the most important thing was just to be honest. I've been learning about your musical background, she said. I had no idea what I was witnessing that night. You're incredibly talented, David smiled slightly. Thank you. Music has always been the most important thing in my life. Even during the hardest times, it's what kept me going. What are your goals now? Victoria asked. I mean, what would you like to do if you could do anything? David was quiet for a long moment, as if he was deciding whether to share something personal. I'd like to return to performing professionally, he said finally. I'm almost ready. Physically, my hand is strong enough now, and I've been rebuilding my repertoire, but it's complicated. How so? The music world is very competitive, David explained. I've been away for 3 years, which is a long time in this business. I need to reestablish my reputation, make new connections, and prove that I'm still capable of performing at a professional level. And while I'm doing that, I still need to work to support myself and my mother. Victoria nodded, beginning to understand the challenge David faced. Have you thought about what kind of help might be most useful? David looked at her with a slight smile. Are you offering to help? I'd like to, if you're open to it, Victoria said. But I want to do it in a way that's actually helpful to you, not just something that makes me feel better about my behavior. David considered this. The most useful thing would be flexibility with my schedule. If I could adjust my hours here, sometimes for auditions or performances, that would make a huge difference. Most opportunities in the music world happen during evening hours when I'm normally working. Victoria felt a surge of relief. This was something concrete and practical that she could definitely provide. That's absolutely something we can arrange. In fact, I'd like to propose something more significant. She took a deep breath and continued. I want to create a new position in our company, Director of Cultural Arts. It would involve organizing cultural events for our clients and employees, maybe arranging performances for company gatherings and helping us develop partnerships with local arts organizations. David looked surprised. That sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for that kind of business role. You're more qualified than you think, Victoria said. You understand both the artistic and practical sides of performance. You know how to work with people under pressure. And you have the kind of integrity and work ethic that I value most in employees. David was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. What about my mother's medical care? The insurance from my current jobs is important for both of us. The new position would come with full benefits, including medical coverage that would be better than what you have now, Victoria assured him. Plus a salary that would allow you to focus on rebuilding your performance career without the stress of working 2 jobs. But David shook his head gently. I appreciate the offer, Miss Sterling, I really do. But I can't accept a position that was created just to help me. That wouldn't be fair to you or to your company. Victoria was struck by his response. Even when offered a way out of his difficult situation, David was thinking about fairness and integrity rather than just grabbing the opportunity. What if I told you that this is something our company actually needs? Victoria said. We spend a lot of money on corporate events and client entertainment, but we don't do it very strategically. Having someone who understands arts and culture could actually be valuable for our business. David looked thoughtful. Would I be able to continue performing on my own time? I don't want to give up my goal of returning to concert performance. Absolutely, Victoria said. In fact, having an employee who's also a professional musician would enhance our company's reputation. We could arrange our events around your performance schedule. David was quiet for several minutes, looking out the window at the city below. Victoria waited patiently, understanding that this was a big decision for him. There's something I need to ask you, David said finally. Why are you doing this? Is it because you feel guilty about how you treated me? Victoria had expected this question and had thought carefully about her answer. Guilt is part of it, she admitted. But it's more than that. Meeting you and learning your story has made me realize that I've been missing out on knowing some remarkable people because of my own prejudices and assumptions. I want to be a better person and a better leader. David studied her face as if trying to determine whether she was being sincere. And what about that marriage proposal you made? He asked with a slight smile. Victoria laughed, feeling embarrassed but also lighter than she had in weeks. I believe I said I would marry you. If you could play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, you certainly did that. So you're going to honor your commitment? David asked, his eyes twinkling with amusement. Victoria looked at this man who had shown such grace and dignity in the face of her cruelty, who had rebuilt his life after devastating setbacks, and who had just demonstrated remarkable integrity. In how he responded to her job offer, she realized that she genuinely respected and admired him in ways that had nothing to do with guilt or making amends. How about we start with dinner? She said, as equals this time. I'd like to get to know you better, the real you, not the assumptions I made. David smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, Victoria saw genuine warmth and happiness in his expression. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that very much. As they sat together in the quiet room, looking out over the city where both of their lives were about to change in unexpected ways, Victoria realized that the most beautiful music isn't always the kind you hear with your ears. Sometimes it's the harmony that develops when people learn to see past their differences and recognize the extraordinary worth in each other. The cruel challenge that had started as a way to humiliate someone had instead opened the door to a friendship, and possibly something more that neither of them had expected. And for Victoria, it marked the beginning of a journey toward becoming the kind of person who would never again fail to recognize the dignity and potential in every human being she encountered.